On the first night at our new home in Texas, Claire and I were still surrounded by boxes, trying to get used to the change. Everything seemed quiet in that neighborhood, until around midnight, we heard a noise coming from the back door. It was as if someone had tried to turn the handle. The sound was clear, metallic, and we both stood in silence, looking at each other, trying to understand. At first, we thought it could be some drunk neighbor confusing himself with the door. It was our first night, and we still didn't know the neighborhood well. I looked through the kitchen window, but I didn't see anyone. The backyard was quiet, illuminated only by the dim light of the pole on the street. We decided to ignore it, convinced that it was nothing more than a deception. The following weekend, however, it happened again. We were on the couch watching TV, when we heard that same metallic sound at the back door. But this time, it wasn't just the handle turning. We heard a click, as if a key was being fitted to the lock. My blood freezed, and I ran to the door, but when I opened it, the backyard was empty. No movement, no sound besides the wind hitting the trees. Claire was pale, clinging to the arm of the sofa. She swore she heard the same thing. I locked the door again, and tested the lock. It worked perfectly, it didn't seem to have been forced. But the feeling that someone had a copy of our house key started to really bother me. The next morning, we decided to talk to the owner. He assured that he had only given the keys to us, and that the lock was relatively new. Even so, I decided to change it on my own. I bought a new set of locks and installed it on the back door and the front door, just to make sure. That gave me a certain peace of mind, but it didn't last long. A few nights later, already with the new locks, the same noise came back. First, the smooth rotation of the handle. Then the unmistakable sound of a key trying to fit, followed by a muffled metallic click, as if someone were testing different positions. I was frozen in the living room, not in the courage to move. I took a flashlight and suddenly opened the door, hoping to scare whoever was on the other side. But again, the backyard was completely empty. But this time there was something different. The dry leaves scattered near the door seemed to have been dragged, forming a trail to the lawn. Claire, looking over my shoulder, murmured, "Someone was here." We decided to install a security camera facing the backyard. I thought that would solve it, or at least give us answers. The next night, we went to sleep quieter, confident that if someone came back, we would have images to prove. The next morning, I went to review the recording. But to my surprise, during the hours we heard the noises, the camera had stopped working. The screen showed only static, as if it had been turned off exactly at the right time. I checked the cables, everything was in place. The feeling that it wasn't a coincidence made me panic. Claire began to insist that maybe we shouldn't have moved to that house. He said he felt a strange presence, as if we were being watched. I tried to stay calm, but deep down I shared the same feeling. There was something deeply wrong there. The following week, the worst happened. It was almost 3 a.m. when we heard not only the click of the lock, but the clear sound of the door being opened. I jumped out of bed, ran to the living room, and found the back door wide open. The cold wind came in, swinging the curtains. But there was no one out there. I streused every corner of the house, armed with a stick, but found nothing. Everything was intact. The only thing out of place were the original keys that the owner had given us. They were on the kitchen table, arranged strangely, aligned as if someone had just used them. After that night, Claire and I couldn't sleep peacefully anymore. We hired a company to reinforce security, but the feeling that someone already had access to the house before us never disappeared. To this day, when I hear any metallic click on a lock, my whole body crashes. The worst part is that we never found out who or what was trying to get in. And I still don't know if it was someone with the old keys, or something that just didn't want us to be there. Would you trust a house where it looks like someone still has the keys, even after changing the lock? When I moved to that little single-story house in the countryside of Kentucky, I thought I would finally have some peace. It was simple, surrounded by trees and with a quiet backyard, the kind of perfect place for someone who wanted to escape the rush of the city. In the first few days, I was busy organizing boxes and trying to give some comfort to the empty space, but soon I realized that something there didn't seem totally right. On the third night, while washing the dishes, I heard a muffled sound coming from the basement. They were slow steps, followed by a continuous scratching, as if something scraped against the concrete. My whole body was on alert, but I tried to convince myself that they were just rats or old pipes creaking. Even so, the feeling persisted, as if someone was down there, moving calmly so as not to be discovered. The next day, I decided to go down to the basement for the first time. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the smell of mold was strong, typical of closed places. But what made me uneasy was finding small crumbs of food scattered near the corner. I followed with my gaze and saw something even stranger, a mattress folded against the wall, with marks that it had been used recently. I had never put anything there since I arrived. Next to the mattress, there were old clothes and a half bottle of water, as if someone had left everything ready to come back later. I stood still for a few seconds, my heart racing, trying to understand. The front door always remained locked, and I was the only one with the key. Still, it was impossible to deny. Someone was using my basement as a shelter. I went back upstairs terrified, locked the basement door, and kept trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was something of the old tenant? But that didn't make sense. The food was still fresh. Someone had been there in the last few days. To be sure, I decided to put adhesive tape on the door that led to the basement. So, if it was open while I was sleeping or leaving the house, I would know. The next morning, when I went down to check, I felt a chill run through my spine. The tape was torn. I had slept all night without hearing anything, but someone at some point had left or entered the basement while I was inside the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, with the lights on, waiting to hear any noise. Around 3 in the morning, I noticed a low sound of steps, very light, going down the stairs of the corridor towards the basement. But what made me even more terrified was to notice that the basement door was still closed, locked inside. I took courage and went there, with my heart racing. I put my ear on the cold wood, and clearly heard the sound of something dragging, like fabric being pulled to the floor. It was impossible to ignore. I wasn't alone in that house. The next day, I called a trusted neighbor to help me check the basement. When we finally opened the door, we found the mattress again, now lying on the floor, with marks of someone who had been lying there recently. There was also leftover fresh food and a half bottle of water. Everything indicated that someone was still using the space. What shocked me the most was realizing that the tiny window in the basement, which overlooked the backyard, was ajar. She had earth marks, as if someone had entered or left there during the night. The certainty that I was sharing the house with an invisible intruder took over me. I called the police and reported everything. They searched the basement and the entire house, but found no one. They just confirmed that the objects there could not have appeared without someone actually living in the place. I was instructed to reinforce locks and check security cameras, but the feeling that that person was still around never left my head. Since then, I've never been able to sleep peacefully in that house. I asked myself all the time, how long was that person there watching me? Would you still come back? This episode left me with a fear that I carry to this day, and made me understand that the worst invasion is not the one that steals things. It's the one that steals your security. When I moved to the annex at the back of that property in the interior, I thought I would finally have the peace I was looking for. It was a place surrounded by trees, isolated enough for me to work in silence and relax after years of living in big cities. The owner of the property quickly introduced me to the neighbor of the main house, a middle-aged man with a neutral countenance. He seemed friendly, although too reserved. In the first weeks, nothing strange happened. I greeted the neighbor from afar, and he just nodded. But I noticed that whenever I turned off the backyard lights at night, a shadow appeared near the fence, still motionless, as if it were watching me. The first time, I thought it was my impression, maybe reflection or the silhouette of a tree. But the more I noticed, the clearer it became that someone was there. Over time, I realized that it was not a coincidence. Whenever I turned off the external lights, there he was, standing by the fence, a few meters from the annex. He never approached, never said anything. It just remained motionless, as if it had all the time in the world. At first, I tried to ignore it. I closed the curtains, put on headphones, convinced me that maybe it was some strange habit, but harmless. One night, I decided to test it. I left the light on until late, close to midnight, and I watched through the window. Nothing happened. But as soon as I turned off the switch and darkness took over the backyard, I saw the figure move, emerging from the shade of the trees and stopping in the same position as always, next to the fence. This time, I was sure it wasn't an illusion. It was him on purpose, waiting for the moment when I turned off the light. The scene started to really move me. I couldn't understand the reason. Why would someone do that? I tried to confront him loudly, shouting to leave, but he didn't react. He just stood there, standing still, as if my words didn't hit him. The next day, I commented to the owner of the property, but he just laughed, saying that the neighbor was eccentric and that I shouldn't worry. But there was something in his silence, something in the way he looked at me, that made me believe that there was more behind this story. One weekend, I decided to leave the annex in the dark from the beginning of the night and sat in the dark, watching through the curtains sly. I wanted to see if the neighbor would show up even without the light ritual. The hours passed slowly, and I almost gave up. But shortly after 2 in the morning, I heard branches breaking and the sound of heavy steps in the bust. When I looked, he was there, stopped again, but this time closer to the fence, with his face slightly tilted to the side, as if trying to see me through the pitch. This time, I didn't scream or make noise. I was just watching, trying to control my breathing, so as not to report myself. He remained motionless for so long that I began to doubt if he was still there. Only when the light of the backyard sensor turned on, reflecting part of the fence, I realized that it had gotten even closer. Now it was right on the edge of the property, less than 10 meters from where I was. What shocked me was the detail I only noticed that night. He didn't blink. I fixed my eyes on him, waiting for any natural movement, but nothing. It was like facing a living photograph. Finally, when a gust of wind rocked the highest branches, he turned slowly, walked until he disappeared into the dark of the woods and never returned that night. Still, I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I decided to talk to the owner of the property, an elderly man who rarely showed up there. I asked if he knew the neighbor who lived next door well. He just stared at me for a few seconds before saying that house had been empty for years, since the last resident had died in strange circumstances. My stomach turned when I realized he was serious. I went back to the attachment, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was someone taking advantage of the story, a wanderer or even an invader who used the abandoned place to hide. But every night, when the lights went out, I knew that, at some point in the darkness, that man was still there. Silent, immovable, watching me for no apparent reason. I started to avoid looking at the fence, but it was impossible to ignore it. The fear of opening the window and finding him there, motionless, waiting, took away my sleep. Until one morning, I took courage and pointed the cell phone with the flashlight in the direction where it always was. The light illuminated only twisted trees. No sign of him. I sighed with relief, until I noticed, seconds later, the shadow of a man projected on the window glass behind me. I froze completely. When I turned around, there was no one inside the room. But the shadow was still there, sharp, as if something outside had managed to cross the dark and project itself inside. Since that night, I've never been able to turn off the backyard lights. When I bought the house, I knew it was old, but I didn't expect to find so many strange details. One of the first things that caught my attention was a door in the upstairs hallway. Unlike the others, it was covered by several layers of paint and had nails stuck all over the frame, as if someone had done everything to keep it closed. At first, I found it curious, maybe a bad reform or something that hid only a useless space. That door, however, started to bother me. Every time she passed through the corridor, her vision seemed almost a challenge, as if the house kept something she didn't want to reveal. I spent days staring at that smooth and stained surface, until I decided I needed to open it. I took a spatula, hammer, and started the laborious process of tearing off each layer of paint and releasing the nails one by one. The work was tiring, and with each nail removed, the wood seemed to creak in protest, as if it really didn't want to be opened. After a few hours, I finally managed to let go of the improvised lock. With a racing heart, I pushed the door that, to my surprise, gave way easily. Behind her was a small, empty room, with walls yellowed by time and a strong, heavy smell of cigarettes impregnated. There was no furniture, only the worn wooden floor and some dark marks near the walls. I spent some time exploring that space, trying to understand why someone would have decided to hide it that way. I found nothing but an uncomfortable feeling, as if I had invaded something I shouldn't. I closed the door, this time without nails, and went to sleep trying to convince myself that it was just a common room, forgotten over the years. But the same night, at 3:14 a.m., I woke up with the unmistakable smell of cigarettes invading the corridor and spreading around the house. The next night, I made a point of checking every corner of the house before going to sleep. The windows were closed, there was no one smoking nearby, and even so, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the smell came back, strong, acidic, as if someone was bringing a cigarette by my side. This time, it wasn't just in the hallway. It seemed to leave the fenced room directly. I approached cautiously, my whole body on alert. With each step, the feeling that there was someone inside grew. I leaned my ear against the door, and for a moment, I was sure to hear a slow and muffled breath. I immediately retreated, locking myself in my room and spending the rest of the night awake, with the feeling that I was not alone in that house. I decided that I could no longer live with that doubt eroding my mind. The next night, I prepared everything. I left a flashlight charged, my cell phone in hand, and stayed in the hallway minutes before 3:14 a.m. The digital clock on the nightstand marked the exact time, and the smell of cigarettes invaded the air again, dense and suffocating, as if someone was smoking right behind the fenced door. With my heart pounding in my chest, I pushed the door that I had already partially unlocked in the previous days. The creaking echoed throughout the house. The light of the flashlight illuminated the empty room, but the smell inside was almost unbearable. And that's when I realized the smoke didn't come from a lit cigarette. It seemed to emanate from the walls itself, as if they were impregnated by something that had never left. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just the old wood releasing the smell of something impregnated, but I couldn't sustain this thought for long. While sweeping the flashlight around the room, I noticed marks on the wall, yellowish spots in circles, exactly at the height of a person smoking. The problem was that the stains were fresh, as if they had been made recently. The absolute silence was broken by a subtle but unmistakable sound, the crash of an ember being swallowed. I pressed the flashlight, aiming quickly to every corner, but the room was still empty. Still, the sound repeated itself, coming from the direction where the wall was darker, and the smoke seemed to spread towards me. My whole body shivered when the flashlight blinked, and for a fraction of a second, the reflection of something metallic shone in the corner, like the tip of a lighter being closed. The smell of cigarettes became suffocating, and I swear I heard a hoarse voice release a short, muffled laugh, before everything suddenly disappeared. The room was just silent and empty again, but the air still carried the smoke that shouldn't be there. Since that night, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Always at 3:14 a.m., the smell comes back, the pop appears, and the feeling that someone is there with me is repeated. I've already thought about closing that door again, sealing it with boards, maybe even selling the house, but something stops me. Part of me feels that, by opening that space, I not only revealed a forgotten room, maybe I let someone leave it. What if it was you? What would you do if you discovered a sealed door in your house, and, when you opened it, you started to smell someone smoking inside it every night? When my wife, Michelle, and I moved into the new house, we quickly realized that there was something strange in one of the rooms. It was summer in Texas, and the whole house was stuffy during the day, except for that room. Whenever we opened the door, an unpleasant cold took over, as if the air had been stopped for years, accompanied by a strong smell of mold that did not come out, no matter how much we left the window open. At first, we thought it was just a ventilation or old plumbing problem, but it was difficult to ignore the feeling that that environment did not belong to the rest of the house. It was as if the air was denser, heavier, making it difficult to even breathe inside. Michelle commented that she always felt chills when she entered, and I myself avoided spending a lot of time in that space, even during the cleaning of the move. Over time, we started to hear comments from the neighbors. A street man, curious to see our change, commented in passing that it was good not to use the back room. When I asked the reason, he just said that the former owner spent practically the whole day inside during his last months of life. He ended up losing his life at home, debilitated, and it seemed that no one liked to enter that room after that. His words kept echoing in my head, especially because we had never mentioned to anyone the strange smell we smelled there. We tried to rationalize, maybe it was just traces of moisture or some structural problem, but not even with heavy cleaning, dehumidifier, and chemicals the air changed. It was as if the cold impregnated in the walls was alive, constant, no matter the heat outside. Michelle began to avoid the room completely, saying that she felt observed when she entered there, even if we were together. I, as skeptical as I was, couldn't ignore the strangeness of that feeling either. After that conversation with the neighbor, we started to close the door of the cold room, and almost never entered there again. However, every night, at 3 in the morning, I woke up sweaty, even with the air conditioning on, and I had the impression that the icy wind came from that corridor. It was as if the whole house breathed irregularly, and the epicenter was always that forgotten room. Michelle suggested that we take all the furniture out of there and use the space as a warehouse, but even closed boxes seemed to deteriorate faster when left inside. The smell of mold stuck to the clothes, and once, when trying to spend a few hours organizing the space, I realized that my breathing was getting heavy, as if the air was denser. It was suffocating. One morning, I decided to face that discomfort and spent a few minutes standing at the door of the cold room, just listening. There was no wind, there were no noises from the street, but inside the room I swore to hear something like a low whisper, almost as if someone was breathing very close to the wall. It gave me goosebumps to the bone. The next day, I called a technician to check the electrical part and the ventilation ducts, believing that maybe there was some infrastructure problem. He examined everything calmly and found nothing. But before leaving, he released a phrase that I don't forget to this day. "The air in here seems heavy," as if it had been busy for a long time. The next night, I decided to close the door of the cold room and put a chair leaning against it, as if I wanted to create a symbolic barrier. Michelle and I went to sleep peacefully, but around 3 in the morning we woke up with a loud pop, as if the wood had given way. I ran to the hallway and found the door ajar, the chair fallen to the side, and the icy air spreading throughout the house. It was at that moment that Michelle, pale, told me something she had hidden. In the first week, while I was at work, she clearly heard someone walking inside the cold room. He said he felt a chill when he saw the doorknob turn by itself, very slowly, until the door hit lightly against the stop. She could never go through that corridor again without feeling that someone was still in there. Every day, it seemed that the room gained more presence. The smell of mold intensified at dusk, even after we tried to clean with strong products. The cold air seemed to leak through the creases of the door, and always at the same time, 3:14 a.m., a heavy silence dominated the house. Even the sounds of the street seemed to disappear. That night, I decided to leave an audio recorder inside the cold room, just to prove to myself that everything was the result of imagination. When I heard the recording the next day, the sound of my own steps became clear in the first minutes, but soon after a sequence of slow and deep breaths began, as if someone was lying very close to the microphone. The last time I tried to sleep with the cold room door open, I woke up in the middle of the night with the clear feeling that someone was watching me from inside. The darkness seemed denser in that space, and even without seeing anything, I knew I wasn't alone. The breath I recorded days before now seemed to echo live, slow, almost tired, as if it came from a body that should no longer be there. Since then, I could never pass through that room without feeling the same pressure in my chest, as if the place kept the presence of those who had lost their lives there. To this day, I keep the door closed, not for fear of the cold, but because I'm sure that if I stare at that space for a long time, I'll see someone lying on the bed that should be empty. From the first day I arrived at the new house, I realized that the silence of the countryside was different from what I was used to. It was heavy, almost as if something remained lurking. The next morning, when I opened the back door to observe the backyard, I saw something that made me freeze. Symbols drawn on the floor, formed by stones and tied ropes. The drawing seemed too organized to be the work of chance, each detail placed with precision, as if it had some specific purpose. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, not understanding what I was seeing. At first, I thought it could be a teenage game or even some improvised art, but the feeling it conveyed was not light at all. It was as if I had stumbled upon something that shouldn't be there, as if I were invading a territory or undoing an order that didn't belong to me. That same day, I decided to talk to some neighbors to see if anyone knew where those symbols came from. Most just said they had never seen anything like it, but an elderly man, who lived a few houses away, stared at me and said in a low voice, "Don't mess with it." He didn't explain anything else, he just turned his back and entered the house, as if he had said more than he should. This reaction only increased my discomfort. At night, I looked out the kitchen window again at the backyard. The moon illuminated weakly, but enough for me to notice something disturbing. The ropes seemed to have changed position, as if someone had gone there and reorganized the forms while I was inside the house. No sound, no sign of movement, just the drawings on the floor, more accurate than before. The cold ran down my spine, and by instinct, I closed all the doors and windows. The next morning, I took courage and went back to the backyard. This time, I noticed that some stones had been replaced by smaller ones, as if someone had perfected the symbols during the night. There were no footprints on the damp dew floor, which made it even more impossible to understand how it was happening. I decided to take some photos with my cell phone to analyze later, but when I opened the gallery I realized that the images appeared blurred, distorted, as if the camera had failed only at that moment. That started to mess with me. During the day, I tried to keep my mind busy, but at all times I felt the strange need to look at the backyard. It was as if something called me, an impulse to check if the symbols were still there. And whenever I looked, they were only more and more symmetrical, as if someone was perfecting those drawings little by little, without me noticing. On a colder night, I suddenly woke up with a metallic noise coming from the backyard. I peeked out the window and saw something that made my body freeze. A crouching figure, moving the stones, as if reorganizing the drawing. The dim light of the moon illuminated only part of his body, but it was clearly someone thin, of precise movements, who didn't seem to mind being observed. When I blinked and looked again, there was nothing else, just the symbols even more aligned, shining slightly as if they reflected a light that didn't exist. The next morning, I decided to remove everything. I threw the stones away and kept the ropes in the shed. I spent the rest of the day relieved, believing that I had finished with it. But that same night, when I opened the back door to get some air, I saw the redone symbols, perfect in the same place, only now in double, occupying almost the entire backyard. From that night on, I began to feel that I was not alone inside my own house. While making coffee or watching TV, I had the constant impression of someone standing outside, watching me through the glass of the windows. One morning, I heard slow and rhythmic knocks on the back door, as if it were a kind of warning. When I got the courage to look through the peephole, there was no one. But when I opened the door minutes later, I found a stone positioned right on the stop, identical to those used in the symbols. The most disturbing thing happened 2 days later, when I noticed that the drawing had expanded until it almost touched the wall of the house. The symbols were no longer only in the backyard, but also on the small balcony, with the stones forming a path towards the back door. It was as if something or someone was marking territory closer and closer to me. That night, I slept on the sofa in the living room, trying to ignore the suffocating feeling that something was surrounding me. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the clear sound of stones being dragged in the backyard. My heart raced. I went to the nearest window curtain and very carefully pulled just a little to peek. The stones were again reorganized, now forming a perfect circle that encompassed the entire back of the house. I couldn't sleep anymore. In the morning, I decided to take pictures and showed them to a neighbor who had known the region for decades. He stared at the images, then at me, and just said, "If I were you, I wouldn't stay here for long." To this day, I don't know who or what made those marks, but the memory of waking up in the middle of the night with that sound still haunts me. And sometimes I wonder if that circle wasn't already a warning for me to never have entered this house. When I rented the house, the owner seemed to be a quiet, polite, and willing to help man. He showed me each room carefully, talked about the structure of the house, and assured that any problem would be solved quickly. At first, I was satisfied. It was a spacious, old, but cozy place, and the location was good. I thought I had made a great deal. But in the second week, I started to notice something strange. Always in the middle of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, I woke up with the sound of the front door opening. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe the old wood creaking, but one night I went down to the corridor and found the owner standing there inside the house. He held a small flashlight and, quite naturally, said he was checking the pipe at 2 in the morning. I tried to be polite and not question too much at the time, but that didn't make sense. He had the keys, it was true, but why did he need to check plumbing at dawn without telling me? The next day, when I asked if there was any real problem in the pipe, he just smiled and said no, that everything was in order. Your vague answer made me even more uncomfortable. In the following days, I began to repair better. Every time I turned off the lights in the living room and went to the bedroom, I felt as if there was someone outside waiting for the moment when the house plunged into darkness. I even locked the door with an extra padlock, but at dawn I still heard that metallic snack, the key spinning inside, as if the owner was entering again. One morning, I took courage and sat on the sofa in the living room, light off, waiting to see if the noise came back. It didn't take long until I heard the key spin again. The heart shot. When the door opened slowly, I saw his silhouette in the gap, standing still, motionless, as if he was just watching me. It took me a few seconds to turn on the light, and at that moment he hurried to say that he had been confused with the schedules, and that he was worried about a possible leak. I kept quiet, but inside a mixture of anger and fear grew. I decided to discreetly install a small camera next to the door, pointed at the corridor. The feeling of vulnerability was unbearable, and I needed proof that I wasn't getting paranoid. In the following days, I waited for the inevitable. And it happened. At 2:27 a.m., the camera captured the noise of the key and the image of the owner entering again, looking towards my room before taking a step inside. I watched the recording over and over again, trying to find an innocent justification for that. But there wasn't any. He wasn't checking anything, he just stood still, breathing slowly, as if he wanted to confirm that I was really sleeping. With each repetition of the video, the anguish grew, making me feel that the house was no longer mine. I was paying to live in a place where I didn't even have security. The next night, I put a chair behind the door as an improvised barrier. Even so, I woke up with the slight drag of metal against metal, the key trying to turn again. The chair creaky with the pressure, but it didn't give in. The silence that followed was more disturbing than any sound. I knew he was there, on the other side, listening to my rapid breathing. The next day, I confronted him directly, still trying to stay calm. He just smiled, denying any invasion and saying that maybe I had dreamed. But when I mentioned the video, I saw the change in his look. For a moment he seemed surprised, then resumed the forced calm. I asked him not to enter any more without permission, and he just nodded in silence, as if my demand was a nuisance. That same night, I heard the key turn again. The difference is that, this time I didn't wait. I turned on the TV at maximum volume, took my cell phone, and started recording in real time, saying out loud that I had already called the police. The key stopped turning. Slow steps echoed through the corridor until the sound disappeared. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing, knowing that, even with evidence, I was still vulnerable inside my own house. I decided not to spend another night there. I took some clothes and stayed in the car until dawn. When I came back, you were already taking care of the garden as if nothing had happened, smiling, greeting the neighbors. The feeling of normality he transmitted made everything even more disturbing. I knew that if I told someone, it would seem like exaggeration or paranoia, but only those who have ever felt observed inside their own house understand the real terror of it. A few days later, I handed over the keys and left without looking back. With every keychain noise I've heard since then, I remember that dawn and the certainty that he would have entered, if I hadn't given a sign that I was awake. Sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't turned on the TV that night? In the first week after we moved into that house, Adam and I were still getting used to the old furniture that came with the purchase. It was strange, but even comfortable, as if the house had kept someone's routine before us. However, we soon realized something that began to make us uneasy. Every morning, when I woke up, there were wet marks on the carpet in the hallway. They were clear footprints, always starting from the front door and stopping exactly at the entrance of our room. At first, I thought it was a water leak or even some kind of infiltration, but the marks were different. They had a human shape, as if someone had crossed the corridor with wet feet. The most disturbing thing was that, every night before going to sleep, I checked the front door and it was locked. Even so, in the morning, the footprints always appeared, renewed, as if someone had passed there while we slept. On the second morning, I tried to register the marks with my cell phone. The footprints were sharper than the previous day, each contour visible, as if the sole had pressed the carpet fiber hard. I showed it to Adam, who was silent for a few seconds before saying that it was probably just moisture rising from the floor. But I knew it wasn't that. There were no random spots, just well-defined steps, as if someone had really walked there. On the third night, I decided to take a test. I vacuumed the hallway, left the carpet completely dry, and even put a cloth inside the front door slit, to make sure that nothing from outside would enter. I slept restlessly, paying attention to every noise in the house. When I woke up, the cloths were still in place, intact. But the footprints were there again, perfectly aligned to the entrance of the room, stopping right in front of the door, as if someone had stood there watching us during the night. On the fourth night, we stayed up late in the living room, trying to see if anyone was coming in. We locked all the doors, closed the windows well, and even left the balcony light on. Around 2 a.m, we heard a low squeak, as if someone's weight had moved on the corridor floor. Adam got up slowly, and when we went to check, there was nothing but the wet footprints already formed, ending exactly at the same point as always, right in front of the room. We then decided to put coarse salt and a dry cloth on the floor, hoping that, if it was just moisture, the marks would not form. But the next morning, the footprints were there again, but this time they stopped even closer to the door, less than a palm from the threshold, as if every night something was getting closer and closer to us. On Thursday night, I put my cell phone to video record the corridor, leaving it facing directly to the point where the footprints always appeared. We slept with the door ajar, in an attempt to catch any suspicious movement. The next morning, when I went to check the recording, The video seemed normal until around 3 a.m., when the image was strangely blurred for a few seconds. When he returned to focus, the footprints were already formed, but at no time did anyone or anything appear passing by. That was enough to leave us on high alert. On Friday, we decided to sleep in the guest room, which was on the other side of the house, just to see if the footprints would continue. And yes, once again they were there, wet and clear, only now stopping exactly at the door of the new room we were in. It was as if it was not only inside the house, but also knew where we were sleeping. The next day, Sophie insisted that we call a locksmith to change all the locks in the house, hoping that it was the work of someone with old access. The man did the job and assured us that now only our keys would work. Even so, the next morning the footprints reappeared. And worse, now they were closer, almost touching the doorway, as if something had tried to enter the room, but stood there centimeters away. It was at this point that fear began to affect our daily lives. Adam went to sleep with a baseball bat next to the bed, and I could barely close my eyes, expecting to hear footsteps at any moment. Every morning, there were the wet, fresh marks, always in the same direction. What tormented us the most was the absolute silence of the night. No door noise, no creaking of the floor. Just the result, as if someone invisible had crossed the house. That night, we couldn't stand it anymore. Adam was on guard until dawn, but no one showed up. The footprints, however, were there again in the morning, now interrupted exactly in the middle of the corridor, as if those who left them had stopped and disappeared. It was the first time we really felt that it had no logical explanation. I insisted on us leaving, and in less than a week we were already looking for another house. Even after we move, I still find myself thinking about it. Who or what left those marks? None of the neighbors reported anything like that, and the real estate agency never mentioned anything strange about the property. To this day, when I remember the cold and silent footprints reaching our door, I feel a chill run down my spine. Sometimes I wonder if it wasn't the house itself, or if something followed us afterwards. And you? Would you have the courage to continue sleeping in this house, knowing that mysterious footprints appeared every day right on the door of your room? In the first week, I thought it was my distraction. Maybe I had forgotten to turn the lock right before going to sleep. But after 3 nights in a row waking up with the window wide open, even swearing that he had locked it, the discomfort began to grow. I lived on the 3rd floor. It didn't make sense for someone to get in there. I decided to install a camera pointed directly at the room. I set up the application on my cell phone and left it recording during the night. But the next morning, when I went to check, the file of that night simply didn't exist, as if it had been deleted manually. I checked the settings and even connected it to the computer, but there were no traces of the recording. The next night, I left the camera recording again, but this time I turned off its Wi-Fi connection to make sure that nothing could be manipulated remotely. When I woke up, I ran to check. The memory card was empty. No record of the early morning. The detail that froze me was that the window, once again, was unlocked and wide open, letting the cold wind in through the room. I started thinking about possibilities: camera defect, card failure, maybe even sleepwalking. But I've never been a sleepwalker. And there was another thing that kept me awake. Whenever the window appeared open, the curtain was folded to the same side, as if someone had pulled it with their hand. It wasn't the wind. It was something, or someone moving on purpose. On the 3rd morning, I woke up earlier on purpose. I wanted to catch the exact moment when the window was opened. I sat on the couch, with the lights off, and I was watching the pitch in the living room illuminated only by the light of the street poles. The clock was ticking shortly after 3 a.m. when I heard the metallic click of the lock releasing itself. The window handle turned slowly, as if someone was on the other side, but that was impossible since I lived on the 3rd floor. The curtain moved slightly, as if invisible fingers moved it away. The cold air suddenly entered, cutting my breath. I was paralyzed, staring at the empty space, but with the clear feeling that there was someone there, even if I couldn't see. The window was open again, before my eyes, and the only certainty I had was that it didn't happen by accident. The next day, I reviewed the camera history. But once again, the file of that dawn simply did not exist. It had not been corrupted or lost. It was as if it had never been recorded. So I decided to put another camera, hidden in a different point in the room, without turning off the first one. This time, I waited awake in the room, hoping that at least one of them would be able to register something. The next morning, I ran to check the devices. The first camera had a completely clean memory, without any record of the night. The second one was still intact, but when I tried to play the video, the screen froze just at 3:02 a.m., at which time the window opened by itself before my eyes. The audio, however, continued to run. It was possible to clearly hear the crash of the lock and then a low, irregular sound, like a breath inside the room. I sat on the couch trying to convince myself that there was some logical explanation, but the sound of that breath still echoed in my ears. I spent the rest of the morning on alert, checking all the locks and even moving the furniture to make sure no one could hide in there. At night, I put adhesive tape on the edge of the window and scratched it with a pen to know if it would be opened again. When I woke up the next day, the tape was cut in half, the risk interrupted, and the window wide open as always. No matter what I did, something or someone kept opening that window. I went to sleep with fear of closing my eyes, wondering what I could have entered during those hours when I was defenseless. On the third night, I decided to stay awake to see what happened. I put a chair facing the window, lights off, just waiting. Around 3 in the morning, the latch moved by itself, and then the window opened with a dry crack. I went there in an impulse, but when I touched the frame, I felt the cold air coming in and a strange feeling that someone had just left. Since then, I can no longer rest in peace. It's not just the window. Sometimes I wake up with small objects displaced, the chair dragged a few centimeters, the remote control on the floor. I've never been able to catch anything, but I know I'm not alone here. The doubt erodes me every night. Will someone enter my apartment, or have I never really been alone since I moved? Would you sleep peacefully if the window of your house opened by itself every night? In the first week after opening the closet, I tried not to think too much about what I had found. It looked like just an empty and forgotten space, perhaps used to store cleaning products. But something bothered me, the lock on the outside, as if it were made to keep something stuck inside and not to protect the contents. The more I thought about it, the more the feeling that the house kept secrets grew. The nail marks were what really put me on alert. They were deep, vertical scratches, almost desperate, right inside the door. I couldn't understand how I hadn't seen it before. In the following nights, the noises began, dry, repetitive beats, as if they came from inside the closet. I got up to check and never found anything, but I always went back to bed with the feeling that something was still there waiting. In the following nights, the pattern was repeated. Always around midnight, I began to hear a muffled sound coming from the kitchen, 3 or 4 quick beats, as if someone was touching inside the closet door. Sometimes the noise was accompanied by a metallic scratch, like nails scraping on the zipper. I got up in silence, went to the kitchen with my heart racing, and when I opened the door, I only found the closet motionless, empty, as if nothing had happened. I started to leave my cell phone recording audio during the night, hoping to record what I was listening to. The next morning, when I listened to the recording, my blood froze. The sound of the beats was clear, followed by a long scratch, as if someone was trying to leave. But the most disturbing thing was hearing a weak, slow breath, coming soon after, as if there was someone trapped inside, even though the space was too small to fit a person. On the third night, I decided to lock the closet from the inside with a small improvised lock, just to make sure nothing could move from there. But around 2:30 a.m., I woke up with a roar coming from the kitchen. When I ran there, I found the lock broken on the floor and the closet door wide opened. The interior was completely dark, more than it should be, as if that opening did not only lead to the space of the furniture, but to a larger and suffocating emptiness. From that moment on, I began to avoid entering the kitchen alone at night. But the noises didn't stop. On the contrary, they also began to occur during the day, even with the house full of light. Always the same pattern, fast knocks, scratches, and sometimes that weak breath. It was as if something was stuck in there and insisted on reminding me, every day, that I was not alone in that house. On the fourth night, I decided to sleep in the living room, facing the closet, as a way to force myself to face what was happening. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with the metallic sound of the closure moving by itself. The door began to creak slowly, opening a few centimeters. The icy air that came out of there left me breathless, and in that brief space, I swear I saw something move inside, as if a shadow had retracted to the bottom. I was paralyzed for minutes, until I had the courage to get up and push the door back, locking it with everything I had on hand. Chair, table, anything to keep it closed. But that morning, even with the door barred, I heard the knocks again, stronger, more aggressive, as if something was impatient for being stuck. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, with the certainty that it wasn't just an old house creaking. The next night, I decided that I needed to somehow record what was happening. I put my cell phone supported on an improvised support, filming towards the closet. I adjusted the screen to stay on, and left it recording, with the microphone very close. At 2:50 in the morning, I was awakened again by the beats. When I picked up my phone to look, the screen was black, even though it was connected to the outlet. The recording file simply didn't exist. This made me realize that no matter what I did, I wouldn't have a way to prove it to anyone. It was as if something inside that closet controlled even the technology around. The next morning, when I took off the furniture that blocked the door, I noticed something even more disturbing. There were more nail marks, now fresh, scratched from top to bottom on the wood, as if someone had tried to leave while I was sleeping. That night, I realized that I could no longer ignore what was happening. I locked the closet from the outside again, but this time I stuck a piece of wood between the handle and the floor, like an improvised lock. Still, I woke up with the muffled sound of beats, stronger than ever, followed by a prolonged scratching, as if nails were slowly going down the wood. I felt my heart race when I realized that the beats only stopped when I got out of bed. In the morning, I went straight to the closet. The piece of wood was still in place, but the door was ajar. Inside, the nail marks were deeper, some so recent that wood chips still fell. There was no way to explain that. I closed the door tightly, but since then I can't get through the kitchen without feeling that something is watching me from inside that closet, waiting for the right time to leave. And you? Would you have the courage to sleep again in a house where a locked closet seems to hide something alive? On the first night, the steps were light, as if someone walked slowly well above my room. I thought it was just the pop of the wood, but I soon realized the rhythm. It was constant, like measured steps, going back and forth. I went up to the attic the next day, but I only found dust and old tiles. Still, the feeling that something was there didn't leave me. When I talked to the owner, he insisted that there was no way anyone could access the lining, because the access had been closed years ago. I tried to believe it, but on the third night I woke up with the same sound, only closer, as if scratches were dragging through the ceiling. The next day, while I was in the backyard, I raised my head and saw the small ventilation window of the lining. My stomach turned when I realized that she closed slowly, alone, as if someone inside had pushed. I heard the footsteps again that same night, but now accompanied by a muffled sound, as if nails scratched the wood above my bed. The noise came at short intervals, stopped, and then restarted, always at the same point. I stood still, looking at the ceiling in the dark, with my breath held, until the sound suddenly ceased, making the silence even more suffocating. The next morning, I took the courage to go up to the attic again. I took a flashlight, and when the light cut the dusty space, I saw something that froze me. Small marks in the dust, as if someone had crawled there recently. The footprints seemed to start near the ventilation window, exactly the one I had seen closing by itself. Different footprints began to appear in the dust of the attic in the following days, as if someone went up there during the night and changed places. There were no signs of animals, no feces, no marks of rodents, just human trails, small like barefoot. I tried to convince myself that it was paranoia, but every morning the marks were in new directions, as if something had walked from one corner to the other while I slept. The worst happened when I found one of these marks exactly above my bed, at the same point where I heard the scratches. It was as if the thing had spent the whole night squatting there, motionless, listening to me breathe. The idea that someone could be living inside the walls or hiding in the lining made me sleepless, and I started to lock the room every night, even knowing that it would make no difference if the entrance was on top. On the third night, the sound changed. They were no longer dragged steps, but something similar to short, fast breaths, as if someone was holding the air and releasing it in a controlled way, right above my head. I turned off the light and stood still, trying to listen better, but every second the noise seemed clearer, as if the thing was leaning over the ceiling, almost touching the lining of my room. I decided to climb again with a flashlight, even against instinct. When I opened the attic door, the cold and heavy air hit me. I walked slowly between the beams, illuminating every corner, until I noticed something new. In the far corner, there was a piece of crumpled fabric, as if it were part of a dirty shirt. It was wet, still smelling of recent sweat. The idea that someone could be using that space as a hiding place made me feel a wave of panic. The next night, I left the flashlight and a chair next to the bed, determined not to sleep. When the clock passed 2 in the morning, the noise started again, first the scratches, then slow steps, well above me. With each pop of the wood, my heart accelerated. Suddenly I heard something fall into the attic, as if it were a tool or metal object, but the sound was muffled, almost controlled. I ran to the outside of the house and pointed the flashlight at the small ventilation window. It was at that moment that I saw clearly. The fabric I had found in the corner was no longer there. Something bigger, dark, moved slowly behind the window slats, and then she closed with a dry thud, as if someone had pulled inside. That night, I couldn't get into the house anymore. I slept in the car, watching the attic window with the flashlight off. There were no more sounds, but I had the clear feeling that if I closed my eyes, something would come down from there. I spent hours thinking about how to explain that, if it was called the police, or if I simply returned the keys to the owner and left without looking back. To this day, when I remember the small ventilation window closing by itself, I feel the same chill I had that night. I don't know what, or who, was living in the lining of that house, but I know it wasn't imagination. If you were in my place, would you have the courage to continue living there?